The morning of my father's wedding, I was on my knees scrubbing the reception hall floors at 4 a.m. By noon, he looked me in the eye in front of 200 guests and told me to leave. What Frank Decker didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the girl he threw out that afternoon was the only living witness to the worst thing he had ever done. And she had just decided to talk. If you are watching this at 2 or 3 in the morning, you are not alone. Drop your country and the time in the comments. Subscribe so every night you can't sleep, you have somewhere to come back to. We are all awake together. But before we get there, let me take you back to the morning everything changed. The first thing I did on the morning of Frank Decker's wedding was get down on my knees. Not to pray, to scrub. The reception hall in the east wing of his Battery District home had herringbone hardwood floors that Frank liked to describe to guests as original to the 1890s. What he never mentioned was that keeping them looking that way was my job, every Saturday, on my hands and knees with a horsehair brush and a bucket of Murphy oil soap that left my fingers smelling like pine for 2 days after. It was 4 in the morning. Outside, Charleston was still dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to the city before it remembers itself. Through the tall windows I could see the outline of the magnolia tree in the side yard, its white blossoms barely visible against the night sky. I had planted that tree when I was 11. Frank told the neighbors he had. I worked through the list he had left on the kitchen counter the night before. 2 pages, handwritten in his neat, controlled script. Polish the floors. Arrange the ceremony chairs, 40 of them. White garden chairs rented from a company in Mount Pleasant. Press the linen tablecloths. Slice the lemons for the water pitchers. Make sure the caterer entrance on the south side was unlocked by 6 a.m. Frank Decker had taught me one thing in 14 years. Make yourself invisible or make yourself useful. That morning, I was both. I had lived in Frank's house since I was 8 years old. My room was at the end of the service hallway on the ground floor, past the laundry room and the water heater. No window. A twin bed with a frame I had assembled myself at 13, because the old one had finally given out. A single bulb overhead on a pull string. I had measured the room once out of curiosity, 9 feet by 11 feet. I had looked up the average size of a prison cell after that, and decided not to think about it again. Frank's room was upstairs. King bed, private bath, a walk-in closet that Patricia, his soon-to-be third wife, had already begun filling with her things. I had carried her boxes up from the moving truck 2 weekends ago. She had thanked me with a smile and the kind of eye contact that suggested she had already filed me somewhere in her mind under household staff and moved on. I did not blame her for that. She did not know any better. That was the thing about Frank. He was very good at making sure the people around him did not know any better. At 5:30, I found the envelope. I was dusting the built-in shelves in Frank's study, the room I was only permitted to enter for cleaning purposes, and only when Frank was not inside. The shelves held a row of framed citations from his years as Dorchester County Sheriff, a mounted base he had caught on a trip to Lake Murray, and a line of books arranged by height that I was fairly certain had never been opened. The envelope had fallen behind the bottom shelf, probably knocked loose when the movers had shifted the bookcase 2 weeks ago. It was manila, slightly water-damaged at the corner, with the seal of the South Carolina Department of Social Services printed in the upper left. My name was on it, not the name Frank used. The other one, the one on the document inside. Eleanor Jane Elaine. I stood very still for a moment holding it. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs above me. Heavy, deliberate. Frank's morning walk. The one he took every day at 5:45 without variation, down to the kitchen for black coffee before his shower. I folded the envelope in half and pushed it into the front pocket of my apron. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I picked up the dusting cloth and was back at the shelves by the time he reached the bottom of the stairs. By noon, the house smelled like gardenias and lies. The caterers had arrived at 6, the florist at 7, the string quartet at 10. By 11:30, the first guests were coming through the wrought iron gate at the front of the property, the women in sundresses and wide-brimmed hats, the men in linen suits the color of sea oats. Charleston in June does not leave much room for subtlety. I moved through the rooms with a tray of sweet tea and sparkling water, refilling glasses, collecting empties, keeping to the edges the way Frank had trained me to. Not invisible enough to be rude to guests who spoke to me. Not present enough to require an introduction. Patricia came down the staircase at noon exactly, and the room responded the way rooms respond to brides. A soft collective intake, a turning of heads. She was genuinely beautiful in her dress, ivory silk with a low back, her dark hair pinned up with small white flowers I had arranged that morning. She looked happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who had not yet learned what she had married into. I watched her from the hallway and thought, she has no idea what she is walking into. I did not think it with cruelty. I thought it the way you think about someone standing at the edge of something they cannot see. Frank appeared from the study at 12:15. Navy suit, silver tie, cufflinks that caught the light when he moved. He worked the room with the ease of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in any space he entered. Shaking hands, accepting congratulations, laughing at things that were not quite funny but became funny because he laughed at them. He did not look at me once. That was normal. Frank did not look at me when other people were watching. I was furniture when the house was full. It was during the cocktail hour that I made my mistake. A guest from Frank's County Sheriff days, a broad man named Dale with a sunburned neck and a firm handshake, asked me as I passed with the tray, "Who are you, sweetheart? One of the catering girls." Before I could answer, Frank appeared at my elbow. "She helps around the house," Frank said. His voice was pleasant. His hand closed around my arm just above the elbow, not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to steer. He guided me toward the kitchen doorway with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it many times. In the kitchen, with the door swung mostly shut behind us, I said it quietly. "The college application deadline is in 3 weeks. You said you would help me with the financial aid forms. You said that in March." Frank looked at me the way he looked at things that had stopped being useful. "We will discuss that later," he said. I said, "You have been saying later for 2 years." The kitchen door opened. One of the caterers came through with an empty tray. Frank smiled at her and waited until she had passed through to the pantry. Then he turned back to me, and his voice dropped to something flat and deliberate, the tone he used when he wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. "I want you packed and gone before the first dance," he said. "Take what you can carry. Leave the house key on the counter." I looked at him. Around us, through the walls, I could hear the string quartet starting a new song, the sound of 200 people laughing at something, the particular brightness of a party that does not know it has a shadow. "You have nowhere to go," he said. "But that is not my problem anymore." He straightened his silver tie, picked up a glass of champagne from the counter, and walked back through the door into the noise and the gardenias and the light. I stood in his kitchen for 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then I went to my room, took the JanSport bag from the hook on the back of the door, and packed what I had. 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a phone charger, my toothbrush, $312 in cash from inside a sneaker under the bed, tip money from the diner on King Street where I worked Sunday mornings without Frank's knowledge, and from my apron pocket, still folded in half, the envelope with someone else's name on it that turned out to be mine. Ruth Ann Buckley was standing near the garden gate when I came out through the side door. 65 years old, silver hair, a navy cardigan despite the heat. She had lived next door for as long as I had lived here. She was the only person at that party who looked directly at me when I passed. She did not say anything. Neither did I. But she watched me walk down the path and through the gate, and I have never forgotten that. Behind me, the string quartet began the first dance. I made it 4 blocks before my legs stopped working. Not from exhaustion, from the particular kind of weight that settles into your body when you realize you have just walked out of the only life you have ever known and you have nowhere to walk toward. I sat down on a bench at Waterfront Park, the one near the pineapple fountain that tourists photograph in the mornings. The park was quiet at this hour, the afternoon heat keeping most people inside. The Ashley River moved slowly beyond the seawall, gray-green and indifferent, the way large bodies of water always seem indifferent to small human problems. I set the bag between my feet and took the envelope out of my apron pocket. Eleanor Jane Elaine. I had read the name 3 times already, standing in Frank's study with my heart doing something irregular in my chest. Now I read it again, slowly, the way you read something you are not sure is real. The return address said South Carolina Department of Social Services, Columbia, South Carolina. The postmark was from 4 years ago. The envelope had been opened and resealed with clear tape, the kind of careful resealing that is meant to look like it was never opened at all. Inside was a single folded document, a monthly disbursement summary. Title 4, E-Adoption Assistance. The header read, in plain government font, Ellen D. Decker, formerly Eleanor Jane Elaine. I read through the columns slowly. Fiscal year. Monthly amount. Cumulative total. The monthly amount was $680. It had been $680 for 14 years, adjusted upward twice for cost of living increases. I did the math on the back of a gas station receipt I found in my bag pocket. $680 times 12 months times 14 years. $114,240. I sat with that number for a while. $114,000. The state of South Carolina had paid Frank Decker $114,000 to take care of me. I thought about my room at the end of the service hallway. 9 feet by 11. No window. The twin bed frame I had assembled myself. The single bulb on a pull string. I thought about the winter I was 15, when the space heater Frank had given me broke in January, and I slept in my coat for 3 weeks, because I did not want to ask him for another one. I thought about the last time I had seen a doctor, which was the year I turned 13, for a school physical that Frank had been required by the district to provide documentation for. $114,000. I had not seen a single dollar of it. Not one. Frank used to tell me when I asked about things other kids had that I needed to understand gratitude. That taking in a child nobody wanted was an act of generosity that deserved acknowledgement, not complaint. He said it with such calm certainty that for years I believed the deficiency was mine, that I was asking for too much, that I was, as he occasionally put it during his less careful moments, more trouble than I was worth. I turned to the second page of the document. There was a section at the bottom I had not noticed before, partially obscured by the tape from the resealing. I peeled the tape back carefully. Underneath, a field labeled biological parent, paternal, with a name typed in the same plain government font as everything else, James R. Elaine, Charlotte, North Carolina, not unknown, not deceased, not a blank line, a name, a city, a man who existed somewhere 80 miles north of where I was sitting. Frank had told me my biological parents had given me up voluntarily. He had told me this so many times and with such specificity, such detail about their reasons and their circumstances and their inability to provide, that I had never once questioned it. The story had been told so thoroughly it had become fact. Except here was a government document that listed a living father with a name and an address, and here was an envelope that had been opened and resealed and buried behind a bookcase, and here was 14 years of a story that was starting to come apart at the edges. My phone buzzed in my bag. A number I did not recognize. Area code 704. Charlotte, North Carolina. I looked at the number. I looked at the name on the document. James R. Elaine. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, 4. On the 5th ring, something shifted in my chest. Not hope exactly. Something quieter and more careful than hope. The recognition that some calls, once missed, do not come again. I answered. The voice on the other end was not the voice I expected. I do not know what I had expected. Something tentative, maybe. Something that matched the uncertainty I was feeling. Instead, the voice was measured and quiet, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was still not entirely ready for it. "My name is Thomas Elaine," he said. "I am a private investigator based in Charlotte. I have been working on behalf of a man named James Elaine for the past 8 months. I believe you may be his daughter. I know this is not a normal phone call. I am sorry to reach you this way. Are you somewhere you can talk?" I looked around the park. A father pushing a stroller along the seawall path. 2 teenagers on the fountain steps. Nobody paying attention to a girl on a bench with a government document in her lap. I said, "I am somewhere I can talk." He asked me to meet him. A coffee shop on East Bay Street, 15 minutes from where I was sitting. He said he would be at the table by the window in a gray jacket. He said I did not have to come if I did not want to. He said if I wanted to bring someone with me, that was fine. He said all the things a person says when they are trying very hard not to seem threatening, which in my experience usually means they are either genuinely trying not to seem threatening or they are very good at seeming like they are. I went anyway, because the alternative was sitting on a bench with $114,000 of unanswered questions and nowhere to go before dark. He was where he said he would be. Gray jacket, 50s. The kind of face that had spent a lot of years outdoors and kept the record of it. He stood when I came through the door, which I noticed, and did not try to shake my hand, which I also noticed. He waited for me to sit first. He ordered me a coffee without asking, which would have annoyed me except that he ordered it black, which was how I drank it, and I had not told him that. "I have been looking for you for 8 months," he said. "James Elaine has been looking for you, in one way or another, for 14 years. He opened a folder on the table between us and turned it so I could read it. A photograph on top. A man and a woman standing on a porch, squinting into summer light. The woman had light brown hair and a wide smile, and the particular ease of someone completely at home in her body. The man beside her was lean, dark-haired, with the kind of hands that belong to people who work with them. "That is James and Sarah Elaine," Thomas said. "That photograph was taken in the summer of 2009. Sarah was your mother. She passed away in March of 2010. You were 8 years old." I looked at the photograph for a long time. "Your mother died in a car accident on Highway 61 outside of Somerville," Thomas said. "A collision." The official report attributed the accident to poor road conditions and driver error on the part of your mother. James was not in the vehicle. He was at work. He found out by phone. He paused. James was hospitalized 3 weeks after the accident. Grief, exhaustion, he had not been sleeping. While he was in the hospital, the state placed you in emergency foster care. Standard procedure when there is no available parent. James signed paperwork when he was discharged authorizing his sister to pick you up and bring you to stay with family while he recovered. I said, "He signed paperwork." Thomas looked at me steadily. "He signed paperwork for temporary placement with family. What happened instead was that a different set of paperwork was filed, a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. James says he never signed it. He says he was not even aware it existed until 6 months later, when he went to the Department of Social Services to arrange for you to come home and was told that you had been adopted, that his rights had been terminated, that the file was sealed. The coffee shop was quiet around us. Someone at the counter laughed at something. Outside on East Bay Street, a horse-drawn carriage went past, the kind the tourists take, the driver pointing out landmarks in a practiced voice. I said, "Who filed it?" Thomas reached into the folder and placed a second document on the table, a copy of the voluntary relinquishment form. At the bottom, a signature. Then he placed a third document beside it, a property record. Frank Decker, listed as foster placement approved by the Dorchester County Department of Social Services. Caseworker assigned, a man named Gerald Pitts. Application approved 6 weeks after Sarah Elaine's death. 6 weeks, I said. Thomas nodded. And there is one more thing. He turned to the last page in the folder. A copy of the official accident report. I could see the standard fields, location, time, vehicles involved, contributing factors. Most of it was clear. But at the bottom, in the section for additional vehicles present at scene, there was a line that had been blacked out. Not redacted with a clean government bar, blacked out with a marker, the kind of job that looks careful until you hold it up to the light. I have the original, Thomas said quietly. Not this copy. The original report, filed the day of the accident, before it was amended. He looked at me across the table. The additional vehicle listed in the original is a 2008 Ford F-150, registered to Francis J. Decker, and the toxicology note that was removed from the amended version. He stopped. It was not about your mother, he said. My mother didn't die because of a truck driver. She died because the man who raised me was drunk behind the wheel and wore a badge. I did not say that out loud. Not yet. I sat with the shape of it first, the way you sit with something heavy before you decide whether you can carry it. Thomas gave me a moment. He was good at that, I would learn. Knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. The original report, he said, lists Frank Decker's vehicle at the scene of the accident. A 2008 Ford F-150 traveling westbound on Highway 61 at approximately 7:42 in the morning. Your mother's vehicle was traveling eastbound. The collision occurred at the intersection of Highway 61 and Bacon's Bridge Road. He turned another page in the folder. The toxicology note that was removed from the amended report belonged to Frank Decker. His blood alcohol level at the time of the accident was 0.12. The legal limit in South Carolina is 0.08. He was not tested at the scene because he was the responding officer's superior. The test was administered at the station house 2 hours after the accident, which is noted in the original report and absent from the amended one. I looked at my hands on the table. They were very still. I was making them very still. Frank had been Dorchester County Sheriff for 11 years at that point, Thomas continued. He had the relationships, the authority, and the institutional knowledge to manage what happened afterward. The original report was amended within 72 hours. The toxicology note was removed. The second vehicle was removed. The accident was reclassified as single vehicle, driver error, I said, and nobody questioned it. Thomas said, one person did. A man named Clarence Webb. He was driving a county transit bus on the same road that morning and witnessed the collision from approximately 40 yards back. He gave a statement to the first responding officer that described 2 vehicles. That statement does not appear in the amended report. I said, where is he now? Thomas said, Columbia. 72 years old. I found him 3 months ago through Transit Authority retirement records. He remembered the accident. He said he had tried to follow up with the department twice in the years after, and was told his statement had been incorporated into the investigation. He did not know it had been removed. He paused again. He signed a new affidavit 4 weeks ago. It is in the folder Susan Mercer will be presenting. I said. Who is Susan Mercer? The woman James hired to handle the legal side of this, Thomas said. Family law, adoption fraud, civil liability. She has been building the case for 6 months. The affidavit from Clarence Webb, the original accident report, the disbursement records you found today, the relinquishment form with the contested signature. He looked at me carefully. You finding that envelope today was the last piece. Outside, the light on East Bay Street had shifted to the softer gold of late afternoon. A couple walked past the window hand in hand, not looking at anything in particular, just walking. The city doing what cities do, moving forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. Frank used to say that my mother had made bad choices. He said it the way people say things they want you to accept without examining. She made bad choices, and that is why things turned out the way they did, and you should be grateful that someone was there to step in. He said it maybe a dozen times over the years, always in the context of reminding me how fortunate I was. I understood now why he needed me to believe that. If my mother had made bad choices, then what happened to her was her own fault. And if it was her own fault, then there was no crime. And if there was no crime, there was nothing to find. And if there was nothing to find, then the girl in the room at the end of the service hallway would stay exactly where she was, quiet and contained and generating $680 a month, indefinitely. I said, How long has James known about the accident? Thomas said, 6 months. The same week he found the photograph of you online. He hired me the following Monday. I looked down at the folder, the original report, the name Clarence Webb in Thomas's careful handwriting, the line that had been blacked out and then unblacked, the truth that had spent 14 years underneath a marker stroke. There is one more thing, Thomas said. His voice shifted slightly, not in tone, but in weight. The way a voice shifts when what comes next is the part the person has been working up to. James is in Charleston, he said. He has been here since this morning. He was outside the wedding venue when you left. Not inside. He did not want to approach you in that situation. He has been waiting to see where you went. I said nothing. He is 2 blocks from here, Thomas said. He wanted me to talk to you first. He said if you do not want to meet him, he will go back to Charlotte tonight, and you will never hear from either of us again. That is a promise he asked me to make to you directly. I looked out the window at East Bay Street. 2 blocks, 14 years. I said, What does he look like? Thomas almost smiled. He looks like you, he said. Specifically, he said, he has your hands. There was a man sitting on a bench outside the coffee shop. He had my hands. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. The way the fingers rested on his knees, slightly curved, the knuckles prominent. The kind of hands that look like they belong to someone who builds things or fixes things or holds things together. I had always thought my hands were unusual. Too angular for a woman's hands, Frank had said once. In the offhand way he said things he wanted to land without seeming like he was throwing them. James Elaine was 48 years old and looked like someone had taken 14 years from him and not given them back. Dark hair gone mostly silver at the temples. A face that had been handsome once and was still something, just quieter now, worn down to the essential. He was wearing a plain blue shirt and work trousers, and he was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a very long time and has learned not to let the waiting show. He stood when I came through the door. He did not move toward me. He just stood. I stopped on the sidewalk maybe 10 feet away from him. Behind me, Thomas had come out of the coffee shop and positioned himself a few steps back, far enough to be absent from the conversation, close enough to be present if needed. The evening air was warm and smelled like the river, and somewhere nearby someone was playing music, something slow and instrumental drifting from a bar on the next block. James said, I am not going to ask you to believe anything tonight. He said it the way someone says something they have practiced but mean. I just want you to look at what I brought. After that, whatever you decide, I will respect it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. Not a government envelope. A regular one, the kind you buy at a drugstore. He held it out. I crossed the 10 feet between us and took it. Inside were photographs. 4 of them, printed on regular paper, the edges slightly uneven, the kind of printing job done at a copy shop rather than a lab. The first was a young woman sitting on porch steps, laughing at something off camera, her light brown hair loose around her shoulders. She had high cheekbones and a mouth that tilted slightly to the left when she smiled and eyes that caught light the way certain eyes do. The second was the same woman, visibly pregnant, standing in front of a small brick house with a red front door. She had one hand on her belly and was squinting into the sun and smiling in the way of someone who is too happy to be self-conscious about squinting. The third was a hospital photograph. A man and a woman in a hospital bed, a newborn between them. The man had dark hair and work-rough hands and was looking at the baby with the expression of someone who has just understood something important for the first time. The woman was Sarah. The baby had her mother's cheekbones and her father's hands. The fourth was a birthday party. A small child, maybe 2 years old, sitting in front of a cake with a single candle, both arms raised, mouth open in delight. Behind her, a red front door. I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I looked at James. She was beautiful, I said. It came out quieter than I intended. He nodded. He pressed his mouth together for a moment before he spoke. You look exactly like her, he said. The cheekbones. The way you were standing when you came out of the coffee shop. She always stood like that, weight on her left foot, shoulders slightly back. I thought about the photographs. I thought about the red front door. I thought about 14 years of being told that the people who had made me had not wanted me, told it so many times and with such careful detail that the story had become load-bearing, a wall I had organized my understanding of myself around. I said, I need a DNA test, not the photographs, not the story, the science. He did not flinch. He did not look hurt. He said, Of course. Susan has already identified a lab on Rutledge Avenue. We can go tomorrow morning if you are willing. No hesitation. No negotiation. Just of course. I had spent 14 years in a house where asking a direct question was treated as an act of aggression. A man I had met 11 minutes ago answered like questions were the simplest thing in the world. I looked down at the photograph of the woman with the red front door and the hand on her belly. Then I looked at my own hands, holding the photograph. The shape of the fingers. The knuckles. The slight forward curl at rest. Identical. 5 days is nothing. 5 days is forever when you have spent 14 years not knowing who you are. James had checked us into a hotel on King Street that evening. Separate rooms on the same floor, a detail I noticed and appreciated without saying so. My room had 2 windows. I stood in front of them for a long time after he said goodnight and closed the door between the hallway and the quiet. Outside, King Street was still going. Restaurants and bars and people moving through the warm Charleston night with the easy purposefulness of people who knew where they were headed. I watched them from the window and felt the particular strangeness of being somewhere safe for the first time in a day that had contained more than most years. The bed had white sheets that smelled like clean laundry instead of the faint mildew I had spent 14 years accepting as normal. I did not sleep well, but I slept. James was in the hallway at 7 the next morning with 2 cups of coffee from the lobby. He handed me one without ceremony and said, Susan Mercer is coming at 9. You do not have to be in that meeting if you are not ready. I can take notes and tell you everything after. I said, I will be there. He nodded and went back to his room to let me get ready. No further comment. No expression of relief or gratitude that I had agreed. Just a nod, as though my being ready was simply a thing he believed about me. Susan Mercer arrived at 9 with a laptop bag and a leather portfolio and the kind of focused energy that suggested she did not waste much time on anything that was not directly relevant. She was somewhere in her 40s, red-haired, sharp-featured, and she shook my hand before she shook James's, which I thought was intentional. She sat across from me at the small table by the window and laid out the case the way you lay out a map. Here is where we are. Here is where we are going. Here is what we need to get there. The DNA results would take 3 to 5 business days from the lab on Rutledge Avenue. Once confirmed, she would file the petition to vacate the adoption in Charleston County Family Court. She had the original accident report, Clarence Webb's affidavit, the disbursement records from the DSS envelope, and a forensic document examiner who had already reviewed the voluntary relinquishment form. The signature on the relinquishment, she said, does not match James's known handwriting across a sample of 12 documents: tax returns, mortgage applications, professional contracts. The examiner's preliminary finding is that the signature was produced by a different hand. The final report will be ready before the hearing. I said, "What about Gerald Pitts, the caseworker?" Susan said, "Gerald Pitts retired from the Department of Social Services in 2015. He currently lives in Somerville. We have requested his financial records from the relevant period through the civil discovery process. We expect to have them within the week." She said it without drama, the way a person says something they already know the answer to. James sat across the room during most of this, in the chair by the second window, reading. Or appearing to read. I noticed that he turned pages at irregular intervals, which suggested he was listening more than reading, but doing so in a way that gave me space. On the third day, my phone buzzed with a text from Frank's number. "I have spoken to my attorney. Come home and we will work something out. There is no need to involve outside parties in a family matter." I read it once. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. On the fourth day, James brought the photographs again. Not to show me, just to leave them on the table in case I wanted to look. I did look. For a long time. I looked at Sarah standing in front of the red door, and I looked at the baby with her arms raised, and I looked at James's face in the hospital photograph, the way he was looking at his daughter. And I thought about all the mornings he had woken up knowing she was somewhere, and not knowing where. Frank used to say that waiting was weakness. I was starting to think waiting was the bravest thing I had ever done. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Susan called. I was sitting on the edge of the bed with the photographs spread around me when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Susan Mercer. I picked up on the second ring. She said, "The lab results are back." She read the number out loud, and I felt something in my chest unlock. Not break. Not shatter. Just open. The way a door opens when someone finally turns the handle from the other side. 99.97% probability of paternity. Susan's voice was steady and precise, the way it always was. "James Elaine is your biological father. It is confirmed." I did not say anything for a moment. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the photographs still spread around me, and the phone pressed to my ear, and I looked at the picture of Sarah in front of the red door, the hand on her belly, the squint against the sun, the smile that tilted left. I was not an accident nobody wanted. I was not a burden someone had generously agreed to carry. I was a daughter who had been taken from a father who had spent 14 years and everything he had trying to find her. The math of that settled into me slowly, the way cold water rises. I said, "What happens now?" Susan said, "Now we move." She came to the hotel that afternoon with her laptop bag and 4 folders, each one flagged with colored tabs, each one representing a different layer of what Frank Decker had built and what we were going to dismantle. She set them on the table in front of me and walked through them the way a surgeon walks through a procedure. Calm, sequential. leaving nothing to chance. The first folder held the DNA results, chain of custody documentation, the lab technician's signed affidavit, the full report. Irrefutable, Susan said, and said it without emphasis because it did not need any. The second folder held the forensic handwriting analysis. The document examiner's final report was 38 pages. The conclusion was one sentence. It is my professional opinion that the signature on the voluntary relinquishment of parental rights dated 2010 was not produced by James R. Elaine. The third folder held the financial records, the disbursement summaries, 14 years of monthly payments totaling $114,240. Gerald Pitts's bank records, obtained through discovery, showing a deposit of $4,000 in the week the adoption was finalized. Source: a personal check from Francis J. Decker. I looked at that number for a long time. $4,000. That was what the paperwork had cost. That was what 14 years of my life had been worth to the man who arranged them. The fourth folder held Clarence Webb's affidavit and the original accident report. Susan did not linger on this one. She simply placed it on the table and said, "This is the piece that turns a civil matter into a criminal one." James had not spoken during any of this. He sat in the chair by the window with his hands folded and his jaw set in the way of someone controlling something very carefully. I looked at the four folders on the table, a whole architecture of damage, organized into tabs and page numbers. I said, "Can the adoption be undone?" Susan looked at me directly. Under South Carolina law, an adoption obtained through fraud, including a forged consent and the suppression of a living biological parent, can be declared void. "Yes," she said, "it can be undone." Then she paused. "There is one more thing. Ruth Ann Buckley called my office this morning, your former neighbor. She said she has been keeping a written record for 3 years. Dates, observations, specific incidents. She wants to testify. Ruth Ann, navy cardigan. The only person at the wedding who had looked directly at me when I walked out." I said, "Tell her yes." The night before the hearing, Frank sent a letter. He used my name. The wrong one. One last time. It arrived at the hotel front desk in a sealed envelope with his return address printed in the upper left corner, the same neat controlled script as the chore lists he had left on the kitchen counter for 14 years. The desk clerk brought it up without comment. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a while before I opened it. The letter was one page. No apology. No acknowledgement of anything that had happened or anything that had been found. Just Frank, doing what Frank had always done, arranging the facts of a situation into the shape that was most useful to him. He wrote that I was being manipulated by a stranger who had appeared at a vulnerable moment. He wrote that James Elaine was not who he claimed to be. He wrote that everything he had done over 14 years had been an act of sacrifice, and that sacrifice deserved consideration. He wrote, near the bottom of the page, that he was willing to forgive me for leaving if I came home before the hearing and we handled the matter privately, as a family. I read the word forgive 3 times. The first time it felt like a door opening. Some part of me, the part that had been trained over 14 years to believe that his approval was the closest thing available to safety, responded before I could stop it. The second time, it felt like a lock clicking shut. The third time, it felt like a hand closing around my wrist. I set the letter on the nightstand beside the photographs of Sarah, the woman in front of the red door, the baby with her arms raised. I looked at both for a long time. A knock at the adjoining door. James. He had seen the light under the door at 11:30 and had not assumed. He had knocked. I said, "Come in." He sat in the chair across the room. Not close, not far. He did not ask about the letter on the nightstand, though I knew he could see it. He just sat, the way he had sat through most of the past 5 days, present without being pressing. After a while, I said, How do I know you are not the same as him? He did not look hurt. He looked like a man who understood exactly why I was asking. You do not, he said. Not yet. I am not going to ask you to trust me because I am asking you to. I am going to ask you to let the evidence speak, and then make your own decision. That is all. He picked up the book he had brought with him and went back to reading. The not pushing, the simple act of giving me room, was the most disorienting thing he had done yet, because it was so completely different from everything I knew. I took the small notebook I had bought at the drugstore across the street and wrote one line on the first page. No matter what happens tomorrow, my name is Eleanor Jane Elaine, and I was never the problem. I closed the notebook. I turned off the lamp. Outside, King Street had gone quiet. I slept. And for the first time in 14 years, I did not dream about a room with no window. The courthouse on Broad Street smelled like floor polish and old certainty. The kind of certainty that was about to get a very rude interruption. We arrived at 8:30. James on my left, Susan on my right, Thomas a few steps behind carrying a banker's box of records. I was wearing a white blouse and a navy blazer that Susan had brought to the hotel the morning before, still in its garment bag, tags attached. Something clean, she had said, practical, as always. My hair was pulled back. No jewelry. I did not own any. My hands were steady. My back was straight. Frank arrived at 8:40 with his attorney, a man in a brown suit who carried a single manila folder and had the look of someone who had been given incomplete information and was beginning to suspect it. Frank was in gray, burgundy tie, the particular posture of a man who believed this was a formality. Patricia was not with him. Donna, his former deputy and longtime administrative assistant, sat in the second row of the gallery with her hands folded. Frank and I made eye contact in the hallway. For the first time in 14 years, I did not look down. Judge Marion Webb took the bench at 9, 60s, silver-haired, reading glasses on a chain. She had the manner of someone who had heard a great many things in that room and retained the capacity to be appalled by new ones. Susan addressed the court without notes. Your Honor, we are here to present evidence that the adoption of Eleanor Jane Elaine, known for the past 14 years as Ellen Decker, was obtained through fraud. Specifically, the forgery of a biological parent's consent, facilitated by a direct financial payment to the case-assigned social worker. She presented the DNA results first, the lab technician's affidavit, the chain of custody, the number. 99.97%. Judge Webb examined the report, adjusted her reading glasses, and set it aside with a small nod. Then the forensic handwriting analysis. The examiner's conclusion read aloud in full. The signature on the voluntary relinquishment of parental rights was not produced by James R. Elaine. Frank's attorney rose. Your Honor, my client holds a legally executed adoption decree approved by this court system. The petitioner is attempting to relitigate a settled matter. Susan did not turn around. A decree built on a forged signature is not settled, Your Honor. It is concealed. We are here to unconceal it. Then came the financial records, the disbursement summaries projected onto the courtroom screen, month by month, year by year. Gerald Pitts's bank deposit, $4,000, 1 week before the adoption was finalized. Source, a personal check from Francis J. Decker. Frank's jaw tightened. Ruth Ann Buckley took the stand in her navy cardigan. She did not perform anything. She described 3 years of written observations, specific dates, specific incidents. She described the wedding, the moment Frank had told me to leave in front of his guests, the bag I was carrying when I walked through the gate. Then Susan placed Clarence Webb's affidavit before the court. The original accident report, the removed toxicology note, the blood alcohol level of .12. Frank stood. His chair scraped the floor. That report is fabricated. I ran that department for 11 years. I would never. Judge Webb's voice was low and final. "Mr. Decker, sit down." He sat. The room had already heard it. The mask had slipped in open court, and there was no taking that back. Susan turned to me. Her voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Would you like to address the court?" I stood up in a navy blazer with steady hands and 14 years of silence finally asking to leave my body. "Your Honor," I said, "I am not here for revenge." The word sat in the air for a moment, and I let it. I am here because for 14 years I did not know who I was. I did not know my own name. I did not know my mother's face or the way she stood in front of a red door with one hand on her belly, smiling at something off camera. I did not know that someone had been looking for me, or that the papers that put me in that house were built on a forged signature and a $4,000 check. I paused. The courtroom was very quiet. Mr. Decker said he gave me everything. Here is what everything looked like. A room at the end of a service hallway with no window. No doctor visits after the year I turned 13. No birth certificate. No identification of any kind in my possession. I cooked, cleaned, and worked in that house from the time I was 8 years old and was told every day that I should be grateful for the privilege of doing it. My voice did not break. I had decided it would not. What I know now is that my mother did not make bad choices. My mother was killed on a highway outside Somerville by a man with a blood alcohol level of 0.12, who then spent 14 years keeping the only living witness to what he had done inside his house and inside his control. I looked at Judge Webb directly. I am not asking this court to punish Frank Decker. I am asking this court to tell the truth. Because I have earned at least that. I sat down. Ruth Ann Buckley pressed both hands to her mouth. James sat with his knuckles white against the table. The courthouse reporter had stopped writing and was simply looking at me. Judge Webb took 11 minutes. When she looked up, she addressed me first. "Miss Elaine," she said, "and I will use that name because the evidence before this court compels it. The voluntary relinquishment of parental rights filed in 2010 bears a signature determined by certified forensic analysis to be fraudulent. The adoption that followed was built on forgery and facilitated by a direct payment to the case-assigned social worker." She turned to Frank. "It is the ruling of this court that the adoption of Eleanor Jane Elaine is declared void and annulled in its entirety. Full restitution of $114,240 is ordered. This court is referring the matter to the Charleston County District Attorney for investigation of forgery, fraud, and negligent homicide in connection with the 2010 accident on Highway 61. The legal name of the petitioner is restored to Eleanor Jane Elaine, effective immediately. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Louder than 14 years of silence. It sounded like a lock opening. In the hallway, I was walking toward the exit with James beside me when I heard it. A voice calling a name that was no longer mine. "Ellen." I stopped. I turned. Frank stood at the end of the hallway. His attorney was gone. His jacket hung open. He looked like a man whose entire structure had just been condemned. "After everything," he said. 14 years under my roof. This is how you repay me." I stood in that hallway with October light coming through the courthouse windows, and I felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he had just said. Not anger, recognition. Because even now, even with a judge's ruling still settling into the air, even with a forensic report proving he had forged a man's signature to steal that man's daughter, even with a toxicology note proving what had happened on Highway 61 14 years ago, Frank Decker believed he was owed something. He had always believed that. That was the thing I finally understood standing there. It was not cruelty exactly. It was arithmetic. He had made a calculation and expected the math to hold, and he could not comprehend a world in which it didn't. "My name is Eleanor," I said. "And you did not take care of me. You managed me. There is a difference, and a court just spent the morning explaining it. I turned and walked down the hallway toward the exit. James held the door open. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He just held it the way you hold a door for someone you have been waiting 14 years to hold a door for. I walked through it and did not look back. 6 months later, this is where I am. I live in Charleston now, not far from the water. A studio apartment on Rutledge Avenue with tall windows that let in so much morning light, I sometimes just stand in it for a minute before I start my day. The windows were the first thing I looked for when I went apartment hunting. I spent 14 years in a room without one. Now I need to see the sky when I wake up. I am studying social work at the College of Charleston. I know how that sounds. The girl who spent 14 years in a broken system is now studying how to fix it. But that is exactly why. I know what it looks like from the inside. I know what the paperwork misses. I know what a child in that situation needs someone to see. James and I have dinner every Friday at the bungalow on the west side of town, the one with the red front door that I recognize from the photographs. He is not a perfect cook. His specialty is slightly overcooked chicken and garlic bread that is always just a little too dark on the bottom. But he makes it himself, and he sets the table for two, and he asks about my week and listens to the answer. We are not perfect. There are silences that stretch too long and moments when neither of us knows what to say because you cannot recover 14 stolen years over Friday dinner. But he is there every week without fail. And that, I have learned, is what showing up actually looks like. Frank is awaiting trial on 3 counts: forgery, fraud, negligent homicide. The Battery District House is under a lien to cover the restitution payment. Gerald Pitts surrendered his pension as part of a plea agreement. Ruth Ann Buckley sends me a card every month. Just a short note. Nothing elaborate. Just her handwriting on a small card saying she is thinking of me. Last Friday, James showed me a photograph I had not seen before. Sarah, standing in front of the red door, laughing at something off camera, one hand raised like she was about to catch something the photographer had thrown. She looked exactly the way I feel on good mornings, like something bright was always just about to arrive. I put the photograph on my desk. Every morning now, she is the first thing I see. My name is Eleanor Jane Elaine, and for the first time in my life, I know exactly what that means. There is a difference between being cared for and being kept. Being cared for means someone wants you to grow. They make room for your questions. They hold doors open and do not keep a running total of what it cost them. Being kept means someone needs you to stay small. They measure your gratitude. They remind you, constantly and carefully, that you owe them the version of yourself that is easiest to control. For 14 years, I did not know the difference because I had never experienced the first one. I only knew the second one, dressed up in the language of the first. If someone in your life has ever made you feel that your existence is something they are generously tolerating, I want you to hear this. That is not love. That is inventory. Eleanor's story did not end in that courtroom. It began there. The gavel came down and a name was restored and a door opened. But the real work, the learning to trust, the learning to take up space, the learning to stand in morning light without waiting for someone to hand you a chore list, that work does not happen in a single ruling. It happens on ordinary Fridays, over slightly burned garlic bread, in the quiet of a table set for two. God sees what is done in secret. God restores what was taken in the dark. And God places the right people at the right crossroads, exactly when they are needed most. If this story reached you, if something in Eleanor's voice sounded familiar, if you have ever been made to feel like a line item in someone else's ledger, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear that the people who made them feel like a burden were carrying their own debts, and simply put the weight on someone small enough to accept it, share this with them. We will see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves.